Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Performance Cafe. And this week we are still talking all things accountability. And today I've got a really juicy topic for you because I think part of accountability is, I was talking to a friend yesterday and we spoke about this concept of no one wants to be the bad guy. And when it comes to accountability, in episode 1, we said that the concept of accountability and being held accountable, sounds rather negative. And so, it's not a positive thing to be held accountable. It's the process itself. We spoke about in the second session. We said that the process of accountability itself is not great. And the reason is the following: is that because we are procrastinating and avoiding because no one wants to be the bad guy, right? So what happens, how this plays out, is someone makes a small mistake and we go, well, we're not going to speak to the person about it. It was a small mistake. They'll probably do better next time. And then we leave it and we leave it and then we leave it too long. And then we go, oh dear, I've left it too long. So now we feel like not only are we upset at them, but we feel guilty in ourselves for leaving it too long. And then lastly, of course, we then get to the point where we go, well, now I better fix this. So now we're going to go in guns blazing. And that means that we have to be the bad guy. We've got to make them the bad guy. It is very emotionally messy and very fraught, right? But we do understand that people need to know how they are performing. And it's so interesting because I got a call from someone the other day that said, oh, I need to give someone feedback, but I don't want to upset them. Just that already tells us a lot about what happens with accountability. I mean to give feedback, I mean to do well, I need to highlight something's going wrong, but I'm already scared that person's going to get scary, as we said in one of our previous episodes. But it's the only way that they know where they're going to go and where they're contributing to the business. So we do need to set up boundaries and expectations for people. So let's first take a look, and I'm going to make a subtle difference between boundaries and expectations. Please understand this is closer to the way I see the situation than what you're going to find on Google. So yes, bear with me while I tell you how I thought this through. So if we take a look at the Cambridge Dictionary, it tells us that a boundary is the limit of what someone considers to be acceptable behavior. It's also referred to as a real or imagined line that marks the edge or the limit of something. So boundaries are really like, imagine if we were standing in the middle of a castle and our castle walls were our boundaries. And we need to understand what those boundaries are, because those boundaries are determined by our values, by our needs. And so what we find is that if we have no boundaries, people don't understand how to show respect and how to show when we are valued to them. And we're going to get back to communicating that in a little bit. Right. So if I don't have boundaries, I don't understand how they work. And I remember we spoke about self-awareness last week as well. So I have to understand not only that I have a boundary, I have to understand where this boundary is, what it is, and how it works. Is this boundary permeable or not? Is it a wall with windows in it so that there's some stuff that can come in? Or is it just a flat wall where I just do not play to this? So, for example, we're going to take a look at a boss who is often abusive and rude. Let's go with that for now. When you have that view in mind, is your boundary wall solid, as in the moment that you're rude, I'm out of here? Is that wall, does it have little peepholes? When we think of castle walls, I don't know if you know, but those long little slits were actually for archers to shoot through. So sometimes you could have a small little slit, and now, of course, today we've got nice big windows. How big is the window in that wall, and what will it let through? Are you okay with the boss being a bit rude when you know there's pressure at home, or when you know everyone's working on a very big project, so therefore everyone's running at a little bit high stress? How big is that window? And that's what you have to know, but you'll only know that when you know about what is okay for you and why it is okay for you. Now, interestingly enough, boundaries are entirely based on our internal makeup. They tend to have a certain consistency across situations because they come from our values. So if you think about it, we're unlikely to have a lot of values at work that say one thing and a bunch of values at home that say another thing, we'll find that there's a fair amount of consistency across them. And they are under our control, because I can decide how much or how little I am going to move or change or adjust a boundary to match a situation. I might decide that with core values, actually there is no changing. So let's take a look at an expectation. What is an expectation? My boundaries are what I decide for me, but because of my boundaries, I have expectations of other people. Now, I just want to add the proviso here from a psychological dynamic that often expectations can cause a lot of stress, because what I expect may not align with what others want to give me. But today, I'm going to talk about expectations as positive things, because I'm talking about an expectation in a work context based on a particular piece of work. So, for example, it might be a bad thing to expect your child of 7 years old to clean his room. Don't know, don't have children. Go with me here. But it is entirely okay to expect that a piece of work that was briefed by a particular deadline is given to you if that deadline was agreed. Right. So what happens is you can hear expectations are external. They focus on the behavior or actions of others that you cannot control. And this is the big thing about accountability, is you cannot control the behavior of others because they have free will. So you might say, I want this by X date. And unless it's agreed at some level, they don't actually need to give it to you by then. Right, they should, because they work for you, they get paid to do a job, whatever the case may be. But if that person believes it's not doable, then they actually have the free will to say it's not doable, right? So that means that in essence, you cannot control that outcome. Only the person who's accountable for it can control that. And that lies within their boundaries. Right. I'm talking about expectations that are very specific to particular situations. I'm talking about briefing in a project, a new tech development. I am talking about relaying a new strategy in the organization where we're talking about how are we going to get this done. I'm not talking necessarily about interpersonal expectations as much as task-related expectations. But the thing is, they always need to be agreed. Right. A quick tour through a couple of boundaries so that we know what is a boundary. So for one thing, could be an emotional boundary where people say, look, I don't like talking about my personal life at work. That's an emotional boundary. A workload boundary could be someone putting up their hand and saying, right, this is how much work I've got on my schedule for the next while. This is as much as I'm prepared to take, or else it might spill over into and upset my work-life balance, for example. Time boundaries. And this is another one where we can use, to set up so that we can protect our time. Remember that boundary is to protect something. We can use that to protect our time from the perspective of, I have so much time for family, so much time for work, so much time for studies. Therefore, I know I'm going to block out certain times to do certain things. And then relaying these so that people understand why I sometimes won't answer my phone, or why sometimes I won't break off a piece of work, because I need to do that deep work. I need to stay in that zone for long to get it done. Communication boundaries. This is a very easy one to set up in a business. And that's just about what do we communicate about and how do we communicate about it? And also what time do we communicate about it? So for example, when are we doing the weekly update? Are we the kind of team that likes to have a quick 15-minute coffee break in the mornings and go, right, this is what's happening for me today or this week? Or are we the kind of team that likes to have a Google spreadsheet or Google Sheet open and just type in a little update so that everyone can see where everyone is, but we really don't need to actually be interacting and talking about it? And these, again, listen to what I'm saying, talking about it. Again, boundaries are things that we need to communicate. Right, we've covered expectations a bit, but just so that we can see the difference, expectations is for me then about being being, on time, having professional behavior, or working on a very particular piece of work that needs to be delivered by a particular time. And again, let's talk it through and see what are the dependencies on those in that work, because then people understand how to prioritize. So, for example, I find that as a manager of people, I tend to just fire off work. And unless people come back to me and go, right, which of these two would you like me to prioritize? I will put them in a situation that's very difficult, because I'm just going, I've handed it off, it will now be done because I can trust my team. But what they do is they come back to me and they go, okay, this is going to take so long, this is going to take so long. Talk to us deadlines, talk to us about level of input, talk to us about collaboration. How can we actually try and get this done? But again, with the talking about, always agreeing those deadlines. So let's take a look. One of the aspects that I spoke about in a previous video was the intent pulse. Now, for those of you who might be watching this video as a standalone and not the previous work, when we do an intent pulse, we've been in a situation where someone has disappointed us and they've not fulfilled on an expectation, right? A deadline was missed, or a project was incorrectly delivered, whatever the case may be. So often we have a situation where we then blow up. So what we do is we take a sheet of paper and we write, firstly, what's the story that I'm telling myself about this? Because that's where I'm going to get out that angry energy, that upset energy. I'm going to write, this person has disappointed me, they're terrible, I think the system is terrible, the end of the world is nigh. You know, the way that we tend to sort of like really go into full emotional load. Those emotions are important, but they can be disruptive when we speak to people. So we can write down that story that we're telling ourselves and how bad we think this is. Get it all out, vent away on that piece of paper, and then tear it up and throw it away. Because what we need to do is we need to track back and say, okay, what are the expectations and boundaries? And how does that fit into what we see here? So I've got a little 4-question module that I call the intent pulse. And we ask the question after you vented. So we've gotten rid of all of that energy, hopefully. We ask the first question is, what does the business need? What is it that I should really be discussing? Should it be the fact that this person has upset us, disappointed us, which is not really going to go down well? Or should we tackle the point where we're saying, hold on, because other people got promoted and you didn't get promoted, we see that we see that in your performance, you're still not picking up, and maybe, there's tension there. Should we be discussing that stuff, or should we be saying, this piece of work was supposed to be delivered? Been keeping track, didn't see that there were any obstacles. This was our expectation. Why did you not deliver? Is that the discussion you should rather be having? Next up, what do you want for yourself? And here's a boundary thing, because this is an internal thing. It is, what do you want for yourself? Do you want this person to fix the work and maybe apologize? Or, what do you want for yourself in this process? Is it merely that you just want to jump in and save the day because it's a client that's very close to you? What do you want for yourself? It's your boundaries. You decide. What do you want for the other person? Now, again, this is a bit of a mixed one, because it's about your boundaries. It's seeing that person through your eyes. But as a manager, you have expectations of them and the role that they fulfill. So the idea is, how do you move them closer to that role that they fulfill? And how do your boundaries translate? And here's a good question. What's their boundary? How about finding out where they're coming from on this? And then lastly, both boundaries and expectations. What do you want for the relationship? So often people will say, gee, they're such nice people, but. Right, so what's that but? Is it a continuous pattern of disappointment, in which case, maybe this is not the right fit? Or is there just every once in a while a once off? Let's see what's the common denominator between them, and how do we help that person improve their performance that way? But what happens is if we do that first page, if we do the venting to someone, then we're most likely going to destroy the possibility to fix the business need, fulfill your needs and expectations, as well as damage the relationship. In a previous discussion, we have spoken about why we don't set boundaries, about this whole, who's the bad guy. And I think that there's a lot to be said about that. In essence, it comes down to, for me, personal issue of power and authority. So, for example, who am I to come down hard on someone? Who am I to correct someone? And it's so interesting because we'll often see this even when the person is the manager. We also see that people battle to navigate. If they're in a smaller team, are we a boss or a friend? Are we the manager or the friend? Are we the leader or the friend? There's something about that there. And then I think the biggest part of it is that people and managers and leaders are just too busy with fluff, and they don't stop and build relationships. Because when I build relationships, I'm communicating both my boundaries and my expectations of you, but I can also listen, hear, and respond to hearing what your boundaries, the other person's boundaries are, and understanding where they're coming from and what's important to them. So if you want to know more, you can go back to a previous version. But I think there are 3 big takeaways from this. Firstly, don't think of boundaries and expectations as being negative. People don't know where to go without them. And it was so beautifully described to me a couple of years ago when someone said they're basically the yellow lines on the outside of the road. So in South Africa, on our tar roads, we will have the white line in the middle and the yellow lines on the outside. And I'm clarifying that in case someone from another country listens to this. And you can stay in the one lane. You might need to go into the opposite lane to overtake or something, but not to go past the yellow lines. And I want to remind you that the yellow lines create safety. They create organizational safety. So it's not a case of, well, you've done this wrong, therefore, here we go, it's going to be a negative thing. It's, oh dear, this has gone wrong. These are the consequences. Let's see how we keep you away from those yellow lines. And the person has to take accountability, and they've got to do that for themselves as well. But I think so often this need to be a bad guy when we are holding someone accountable really thwarts all our best efforts. The next point I'd like to highlight is, when do we set boundaries? I like saying from day one, we start and set up our boundaries and we discuss them. I've mentioned it 1,000 times, and there's a reason for that. Is if I don't discuss a boundary, I actually don't walk around with a wall around me. People are going to ride roughshod over boundaries, not because they mean to be rude, but just because their boundaries aren't the same as yours. And so they, in their turn, just assume that it's okay what they're doing because it's not something that is boundary material for them. I also think that it's kind of important to notice that when we're discussing them and as we go through a process, our boundaries might move slightly. I know I said they're based in values and some of them can be quite rigid, and I'm fine with that. But we will realize that we have boundaries with people, and as we get to know them, we might actually make those windows in our boundaries a little bit bigger through trust and through, building up relationships with people, which is why I'm so keen on talking to people as managers. The other thing as well is that the boundary can then shift back to having smaller windows when you've been disappointed. That's okay. You're busy taking care of you. But as long as that's communicated, and it's I think it touches my heart so deeply that we can't have tough conversations with people in a way that's constructive. But it's really about saying, sorry, but the last time this happened, I was really disappointed. I was really hurt. I just need a bit of time to reset. Let's start working together again, and we build the relationship up from scratch again. And that's how this works. We go like this with our boundaries, or at least with the windows in our boundaries if we don't want to move the entire boundary. So I think it's important, and I hope I've managed to express this essence today, that without boundaries and expectations, people don't know how to treat us. And the boundary is not about, it's about creating safety. It's not necessarily about cutting people out. So it is in our power to open and close the windows, or adjust the size of the window, so that we can let people in. And that in this way, through that and constant discussion and keeping track of people, we actually can build the trust so that we need fewer boundaries as we go along in relationships. If people are comfortable with each other's boundaries, if they really know each other, the process of holding accountable becomes so much easier. Because what we see then is that we understand where people are coming from. It's not just the boss is in a crazy mood. It's the boss has a boundary, we're all aware of the boundary, and we all understand the expectations around the project. So yes, I hope that this is going to give you plenty of food for thought. It has been, and it continues to be, a great trip through accountability, and I'm really doing my darndest to see how we can make accountability a little bit easier to do and a little bit more positive in organizations. So I hope that you've enjoyed that insert, and if you did enjoy this, please go back to Performance Cafe and go and look up all our other videos on accountability. There are quite a couple of them by now, and if you like the tone of it, there are also earlier videos relating to something called productive kindness, very close concepts. You can try and look those up as well. They might be interesting to you as well. And then, of course, we also stream across all of the major social media channels, so you can find us there. And where's my coffee? If we don't find you on one of those, we will see you next week, Wednesday, at the Performance Cafe.